Good evening, all. I'm going to be going through a bunch of slides talking about the application of drones to archaeological prospection, archaeological documentation, and I want to kind of touch on a series of applications and possibilities for this emerging technology. And at the heart of it is, how do we get beyond generating pretty pictures from the air and start moving towards analytic value added from the information that we're collecting? So I'm going to be talking about basic approaches to field mapping using the technology. And I want to touch upon, how do we know it's accurate? How do we know we're getting good quality research output? What are the implications of rapid development of technology, specifically the appearance of different kinds of sensors that detect different kinds of light reflections and thermal radiation? And then finally, how do we integrate all of this information with all of the more conventional information to get something that is more insightful? Now, I'm going to be talking mostly about archaeological sites, but the very end of the presentation, I'm going to touch upon application of some of this technology to the investigations of residential school sites. And I've asked not to have the last bit of the presentation recorded because there's some proprietary information. I have permission from the communities that I'm working with to make this presentation of their information tonight, but I'm not all that terribly sure they'd be comfortable with it being disseminated widely. So at the heart of drone mapping is the fact that it's not something particularly new. It dates back to very early days of aerial photography, and specifically early MacGyvering of gas-powered radio-controlled airplanes that had conventional standard SLR cameras slung underneath of them. Some of the classic kinds of things that were well established as kind of a niche application in the 60s and 70s is the example of Pueblo Bonito. After about 2014 or 15, this began to very dramatically change as this emergence of microelectronics that are being developed and utilized in consumer products, plus the development and rapid improvement of digital photography, targeting consumer markets, suddenly saw very, very sophisticated drones becoming available as hobby toys. And to my surprise, these machines have got a fairly considerable research capacity. So this is having a kind of democratizing effect where formerly inaccessible technologies are now readily available at a surprisingly low cost. Now the question is, are we getting value for those costs? Are we getting something that is of research value, or is it merely a novelty? You will have to decide at the end of this presentation of whether it is merely a novelty. But some of the use cases that I've been thinking about and working on are listed down the left-hand side of this slide. And as you can see, there's a bunch of potential uses, some of them that are blindingly obvious, and others that are perhaps not so much. And much of this implementation, this technology transfer, is going to be related to people experimenting with the technology and figuring out what works and what doesn't, and most importantly, how not to crash the damn plane. Now, this set of illustrations here are some of our first efforts that dates back to 2016. And it is a rock structure along the banks of the Current River in Thunder Bay that were submerged and flooded in the late 1800s as part of the creation of an early reservoir. When the water is drawn down, these features pop back up onto the surface. But I want you to think about how big this feature is and how much time and effort it would take to map it using conventional methods. And then think about a 20-minute flight. Get it up in the air, capture the imagery, get it back down on the ground safely, take the images, process them in through photogrammetry software, and perhaps no more than 5 or 6 hours of data processing, and you've got a pretty accurate high-resolution map. This is something that is incredibly important as we try and do more with the resources, the financial resources, and the time that we have, both in academic archaeology as well as in consulting. Now, there is an enormous range of technologies that are out there, and all of these are drones that are manufactured by a Chinese company called DJI. And you will see a very significant price spread, and also a pretty significant variation in the capacity of the machines. And when everyone looks at this, they start thinking, well, yeah, we got to have the fancy, expensive ones, but not necessarily. These small-scale, consumer-grade machines have spectacular capacity for specific purposes. And I want you to be thinking about reconnaissance archaeologists going out to document sites as part of their surveys, and think about a foldable drone that weighs less than 1/4 kilogram being one more piece of equipment in the truck. And in circumstances where you're trying to do photo documentation from the ground, most of us who've done it know how frustrating it is and how poor quality the images are once you get them back to the laboratory. By unfolding this machine and tossing it in the air, you can capture very high quality images relatively quickly and relatively inexpensively, with not a great deal of training. Now, as you move up in the cost, the capacities significantly increase. And the challenge here is to figure out what is the price that you can afford and what is the kind of output that you want given the kind of budget you've got for purchasing and utilizing drones. They come in diverse forms, most specifically in terms of the payload that they're carrying. Some will be standard visible light cameras, RGB cameras, that are becoming increasingly high resolution. It's pretty much standard that the very, very basic level will have a 20 megapixel camera. Most are considerably better quality now. Many of the images that I'll show you tonight are 16 megapixel. These are now obsolete antiques that date to 2016, 2017. Those machines are no longer available. And frankly, this stuff goes obsolete really, really quickly. So in that sense, it's kind of smart to start with the basic entry-level machines for your evaluation. Some machines are able to capture multispectral imagery. Some are able to capture thermal imagery. Some are also able to carry and generate LiDAR output. Now, in the world of archaeology internationally, drones are pretty widely utilized, drones with multiple different sensors. But when you do a lit review, you discover that most of the applications are focused upon old world sites and sites with monumental architecture, and that's not a particularly common feature of Canadian or North American archaeology. And that has led many to believe that, well, it's kind of a waste of time because we've got no structures that will show up. I'm going to be showing you some structures that are extremely subtle. They can only be detected in perhaps 4 or 5 centimeter contour interval mapping, all of which generated from a drone. But you need to carefully plan the right kind of technology to match the site circumstance that you find yourself in. Now, drones can also be highly variable in terms of the image resolution that's generated. And I want to provide a few comparisons. So this is standard 2-meter resolution orthophotography. Looks pretty boring, blurry, and not terribly informative. This is considerably better half-meter resolution Google Earth imagery, while this image generated from a drone in 2016 is about 1.4 centimeter resolution. Now, that produces an enormous data file that when you tried to print it on a sheet of paper would be bigger than most posters. These data are really dense. They require a lot of data storage capacity and a lot of processing capacity. And frequently, when we dumb these images down to the point where we can present them on paper, they don't look all that terribly interesting. It's only when you start zooming in that you start seeing the interesting detail. Here is one of those zoom ins. So this is a chunk of bush or a grassland in the middle of this site, and you can see the scale that I've marked in there is a 10-meter interval. Note this survey box sitting on the ground here. This is a detail of that. It looks kind of blurry, looks kind of ugly, but remember, this is a 2016 image using a drone that has, 12 megapixel camera. More recent drones would have 3 or 4 or 5 times the image resolution capacity. These images have analytic value. Now, what you can see here is that there is an open clearing covered with scrub and bush and low tall grass, surrounded by closed canopy forest. This is the results of the photogrammetry. The intense red zones that you see are capturing the top of the tree canopy. So you've got a lot of false relief represented in the RGB imagery, but in the open areas where the camera is able to get a closer sense of what the ground is, one can start picking up undulations in the ground, even with that surface vegetation cover. Another important issue is that drones that are widely available now have considerable telemetry capacity. They give you a lot of information about what the status of the flight is, what the status of your batteries are, what the signal strength is, all kinds of really important information to help reduce your crash risk. They become a little bit idiot-proof in terms of flying, but we're left with the problem of not really being sure about the accuracy of the imagery that we're generating. Much of the X and Y and Z coordinates that are associated with each of the images are deriving from onboard instrumentation. There's onboard GPS units, and they are capturing X and Y coordinates that are probably within about 2 meters resolution, 2 meters accuracy. Not that great, but way better than how we used to do it in the bad old days. Elevation is determined using an onboard altimeter. And what we need to be thinking about is what is the level of precision and accuracy that we can generate from those consumer grade machines. What we're looking at is probably that kind of circumstance. We've got pretty good precision, but not great accuracy. We're missing the bullseye. What we're wanting is this kind of circumstance where we have both accuracy and precision. And a lot of that we're not really aware of until we conduct experiments, doing repeat flights over the same piece of ground using the same flight plan in repetition, so that we get multiple flights under exactly the same conditions. The only thing that varies is the satellite geometry of the GPS systems. And what we see is that there's a fair bit of slop. We may have precision, but we don't have accuracy. We can address that in a number of different ways. One way that I've been experimenting with is the use of RTK ground control stations, such as this machine that is set up to capture the coordinates of a whole series of traffic pylons scattered across the survey area. So we have a much more precise coordinate for those control points, and we can use those precisely georeferenced control points to warp and twist the output in order to kind of hammer it into the right georeferencing location. A somewhat more sophisticated and much more expensive approach is to use RTK-enabled drones. And that is this example here, as well as the one in the right-hand image, that is got an RTK antenna attached to the top. And it is simultaneously receiving signals from the base station and the satellites in order to provide real-time correction of the geographic coordinate system, and also the vertical axes. Now, how do we use this kind of technology for field mapping? This is a set of images from Brandon House 4 in southwestern Manitoba. The lower image is just a grubby old Google Earth image. It's considerably better than the old black and white air photos, but it's not that great. It looks kind of fuzzy. There's not a lot of detail. One of these little $800 fold-out drones could produce imagery of this resolution. Low elevation, high resolution imagery that is user specified. You can set up the site locations, you can set up the framing, you can adjust the aperture and the exposure, and capture imagery multiple times in order to get the right spot, get the right view, get the right exposure. More sophisticated use of drones for mapping include the use of semi-autonomous flight planning software. And essentially this turns your drone into a wee flying robot. Before you begin the flight, you set up the boundaries of the survey area. You specify how much overlap between individual frames. You want to determine the elevation of the flight. You want to determine the speed of the flight. And it will lay out a flight plan that can be saved and uploaded to the drone so that when you're ready to roll, you upload the flight plan, hit start, the machine will automatically take off. It'll fly to the appropriate elevation and start point, and then systematically mow the lawn for you, capturing images following the specifications efficiently, quickly, while saving as much battery life as possible. You don't want to be fiddling around trying to get into the right spot when you've got maybe a 20-minute battery life. Now, the great thing about this flight planning software is that you can also have the machine calculate when the batteries are getting scarily low, and it will automatically pause the mission, fly back to where you're standing at the start point. It'll land, it'll shut itself down. You can swap out, put a new battery in, and relaunch the mission. It will then take off and go exactly to the spot where it left off and resume the flight. So some of the imagery that I'm going to show you is 2 or 3 or 4 mission flights that are well over an hour long. And it's absolutely terrifying to have a bird in the air that long, but it does allow you to capture very large areas using relatively inexpensive drones. Here's an example of a site near Thunder Bay that I suspect is Plano Age on the rolling uplands of the Kaministiquia Delta. And what we have is a series of lithic scatters found out in this potato field that didn't make a whole lot of sense until we got better quality imagery to capture the microtopography of the site locality. And you can see the drone output in the upper parts of the image with the red splotches representing the lithic scatters. And we can start seeing the correlation between landforms that are important 9,000 years ago that probably condition decisions about where people are settling on the landscape. Some of this freehand, put a drone in the air and capture information can also be done on a very spur-of-the-moment ad hoc fashion. And this is a technique that we used during a collaboration with Slate Falls First Nation, where they were asking us to help them document community history. They wanted I and my colleague to collect information from elders about life and times in the old village, and then have archaeological reconnaissance in order to relocate and document some of these important places in the history of the community. So you can see my colleague Frederico conducting ethnographic interviews from the shore, looking towards places where these old cabins are located, and collecting information about who lived where and how long ago and what they were doing and whose family are they related to, while the archaeologists are stumping around in the bush finding physical remnants on the surface. Now, the physical remnants on the surface are pretty hard to see given all of that dense overstory of brush and trees and tall grass and deadfall. An important part of the process involved finding these localities, clearing some of the obscuring vegetation out of the way, and then very nervously putting a drone in the air, flying below the tree canopy, doing freehand image collection, probably from an elevation of about, probably no more than 7 to 10 meters in the air. It's absolutely terrifying, particularly when it's your own $2,500 drone dodging tree branches, but bloody worked. You can see some of the output here representing the foundations of an old cabin that dates to the early 20th century. Now, the relief variation is very, very subtle. It's extremely hard to see even when you're walking on the ground, but it popped beautifully after the photogrammetry was done with the imagery. That imagery is then utilized as part of the mapping conducted by graduate students who were working on the project. This is a scatter plot of surface recoveries from that early 20th century cabin that reflect the very early days of the community settling into specific localities and establishing cabins rather than the regular movement of tent and wigwam dwelling hunter-gatherers. Now, at the heart of this is this big fancy word called photogrammetry. And essentially it's a way of stitching individual photographs, overlapping photographs together in order to create a mosaic. But more importantly, the different perspectives of each of these overlapping images allows for an estimation of relief change. And that estimation of relief change allows you to create three-dimensional models, both elevation models as well as 3D images that you can interact with by changing the perspective and the viewpoint. I've got an example of that workflow here. Now, this is, again, one of our very early experiments dating back to 2016. And it's an old barn foundation out in the middle of a canola field early in the spring. And I parked myself on the side of the road because I didn't want to walk into the farmer's field, and launched from that location and flew the structure. This is, I forget what the elevation is, but when you look at the imagery, it's pretty good. It's probably at least 40 meters in the air. So this is a shot from 40 meters away, and it's still pretty good, sharp quality imagery. Now, the process involves setting up the flight plan, executing it, capturing all of those overlapping images, cutting the lawn, then bringing all of those images back, downloading them into a computer, and then processing them using the computer software in order to create a mosaic that stitches all of those overlaps together, using common points that the software has discovered, and also generating that three-dimensional relief model, the topographic model. That data can then be uploaded into standard GIS software, and subjected to a series of analyses in order to draw out information. In this case, a simple contour map. This is a much larger scale version of the same kind of thing. It's essentially an attempt at thinking about drones as a tool for landscape archaeology. We went to an uninvestigated bison kill site that has never had any archaeological inspection. The archaeologists working in the region had identified drive lanes that formed a funnel that converged at the top of one of these rolling knolls out in the open prairie. And the question I had was whether we could map it in order to find the larger landscape within which the kill operated, whether we could see the surface features, the rocks forming the drive lanes, and whether we could interpret that data to get some insight in how the technology of herding bison into a trap might have been conducted. This is some Google Earth imagery dating back to the late 2000 teens, as opposed to a very modern one. And look at that. That undeveloped road allowance now has a road blasting right through the edge of the site. I don't think the Manitoba Heritage Authorities are aware of this development. This slipped through the cracks. Probably it didn't get any kind of environmental impact assessment. We have absolutely no idea of whether that road construction and ditch excavations trashed the edge of the site. But think of drones as a quick and easy way of capturing information about change analysis of already documented sites as a cultural resource management tool. The imagery we generated is pretty spectacular. This is one of those very long flights at 60 meters in the air with about 80% overlap between images over 12 hectares of ground. Now, you can appreciate my anxiety as I was watching this thing in that high elevation, getting caught by the wind and being pitched around. It successfully completed the job over 4 batteries. We collected something like 429 images that resulted in data storage requirements of over 2 gigabytes. And the output map is enormous. It's something like 8 by 3 meters in extent if I printed it raw onto a sheet of paper. It's almost a half gig alone. Now, if you're thinking about multiple flights, multiple iterations of data processing, this one individual site could generate many, many, many gigabytes of storage space requirements. This has to be thought through very carefully as one moves towards these kinds of high resolution image capture. We also played silly games with some viewshed analyses where we know the drive lanes are on the side, southwest facing side of this hill. The kill is probably at the base of this slope. And I thought, well, let's pretend we've got a bison eyes view at this location. What will the bison see while standing in that location? Anything orange is what the bison can see. Anything blue is invisible. So the bison literally have to go to the top brink of slope, well within the open funnel of the drive lanes, before they can see the top surface. And one can imagine bison being driven uphill, up this long, gentle slope, with people hiding behind the rock cairns until they get to the very top where they're stampeded. They try and run over the top of the hill, down that steep slide, and into a pound on the other side. I've also been spending a lot of time talking about how I was documenting fur trade sites in my misspent youth in the early 80s, and how much time, sweat, pain, and tears it required, as opposed to how I would do it now. And this represents an image that represents my topographic mapping from 1981. Terry Gibson did some of his very early proton magnetometer work on this site as part of his master's thesis. In 2016, I flew it again, and you can see the 20-year-old contour lines laid on top, as opposed to a much better quality drone that I flew about 2 years ago over the same property. And you can see, yeah, many of the same features are showing up, but the detail and resolution is much better, higher quality. You can see many, many more features. And with processing within GIS, you can draw out some of these very subtle features for interpretation. This is a similar kind of project that had its beginnings in the early 1980s with a sketch plan of a fur trade post written in 1890 by J.B. Terrell during his geological survey of the Assiniboine Basin. Subsequent to his visit, the land was homesteaded and broken up, and when I visited about 100 years later, the farmer gave me permission to do a systematic survey pickup. And I think it's 10-meter interval blocks where we collected everything within each of those grids and plotted. This took an enormous amount of time. And it's not all that terribly informative. I did very much the same sort of thing with the drone as the topographic backdrop, with the scatter plots of different classes of artifacts laid over top. It becomes intuitively much more readily interpretable and at a significantly lower cost in terms of time and effort. Now, this is not new and revolutionary. There's a number of archaeologists all over the place playing and experimenting with similar kinds of technologies. The folks at Lethbridge are doing a bunch of this kind of thing too. In this case, what they're doing is mowing off the tall grass in order to expose a teepee ring and doing some standard RGB photography and also some thermal imagery. And the bright spots are rocks that have absorbed heat through the day that is now radiating that heat into the early evening sky. So all of those rocks appear like little day glow blobs. A really, really effective and efficient way of documenting sites when you've got a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time. But we're left with the problem of how do we validate this remotely sensed data? How do we know what we think we see actually exists? How do we engage in the process of getting research value added out of this information? Now, I want to spend a series of slides here talking about a project that I and one of my grad students completed a couple of years ago. And we were asked to do a non-invasive documentation of yet another fur trade post in southern Manitoba. And it was a community-based project where the community initiative was to develop cultural heritage interpretive panels on the property as part of a local effort at local history documentation. It's a provincially designated historic site. The province said, yeah, that's great, but we don't want you to be doing anything in a way that might be damaging the archaeological deposits underneath. We need to know where the archaeology is before you set up your exhibits. And you can't dig in order to find those deposits. So how do you go about investigating it non-invasively with any means of validity checking? We got to get it right the first time. Now, this site location is very close to the junction of the Qu'Appelle and the Assiniboine River, and it's a series of posts, two of which are important for this discussion, Fort Ellis 1 and 2. And these represent important Hudson's Bay Company guard posts on the edge of the northern eastern plains. But the sites also played a very important role in the sort of the late days of the fur trade, the development of the Métis cart brigade system across the northern plains, and also figured very prominently in the very early days of homestead settlement in this part of Manitoba. I had a bunch of different classes of information. I had some aerial digital data of varying qualities. I also had a bunch of archival imagery, and I had the drone output. And the challenge was to try and smush all of that information together into some kind of coherent whole. The imagery is amazing. The historic imagery is spectacular. And it provides a sense of what the place looked like, what the landscape looked like, who were the people who were coming to this place to trade, but where is the actual location on the ground? This is provincial LiDAR data with 1 meter resolution, and I took the 1846 plan from essentially generated by military intelligence officers on a surreptitious expedition across Western Canada to evaluate the defendability of British territory at the height of the American annexation interests on Oregon and Washington. You know, deja vu all over again, right? So what we did was take this sketch plan, which is scaled, and plunked it down on top of the most obvious features that exist on the landscape now. And we didn't get a particularly good fit. I had to shrink the historic image down, I think, to 90% of total in order to make the best match to the surface features. It kind of worked, but it was kind of dissatisfying. How do I know that it's accurate? How do I know that it's credible? Is there an independent means of evaluating that best fit, or is it just wishful thinking? We focused on addressing those critical questions in our examination of Fort Ellis 2. And again, lots and lots of historic imagery that gave us a lot of detail about the layout of the post. It also made it very clear that this post evolved very significantly in its layout and internal structure over its 30 or 35 years of operation. We also have a post that coincides with the very early days of colonial possession of Western Canada by Canada after the 1870 purchase of Rupert's Land. But we also have a bunch of documentation that represents the very early legal survey and subdivision of Prairie, Manitoba. And this includes some very detailed legal survey documents produced by the Hudson's Bay Company in order to set up their reserves of land that they were going to hang on to in spite of selling most of the land to Canada. And many of these survey documents are scaled and very accurate and tied to measurable landmarks and monuments. So this becomes an opportunity for us to independently evaluate whether what we see on the ground with the drones actually coincides with the historic record. This involved a lot of cartographic magic using GIS in order to recreate where the survey monuments are accurately, and then relay the survey transects onto that GIS data layer in order to get into the locations identified by the surveyors that were containing the fort site. And this transect line is represented in the red here. When we start looking closely at these sort of 1870s to 1880s images, we can see where the land speculation efforts of the Hudson's Bay Company were laying out town sites in anticipation of a settlement that were locating in the prime real estate, their property of Fort Ellis 2. Because we could accurately place these images on the current landscape, we were able to independently place the fort site using the historic documents and then evaluate what the drones were telling us to see if there was convergence. So this image contains both 1 meter and 2 meter resolution data, the National Topographic Survey branch shapefiles, UAV data of multiple different sensors, and using GIS to integrate all of this information into one coherent package. So this is the output from the drone carrying a LiDAR sensor, and it is generating a elevation point for every 5 centimeters on the ground. Massive big data sets, very, very high detail. This is the 1 meter resolution data. So this is 400 times higher resolution than this data. Doesn't look all that terribly impressive at this scale, but when you zoom in, you can see many, many details that you can't see in the coarser resolution provincial public data. We also flew multispectral, which was not as successful as we would have hoped because it's multiple species of plants of different maturities and therefore different light reflections coming from the plants. But the thermal data was surprisingly good. All of these bright spots represent either trees or barren surfaces where the rocks have absorbed heat through the day. But you'll notice all of these cool pathways, these linear strips, where we have very, very subtle footer trenches from the stockades that are probably filled full of fine sediments, probably holding more water, and therefore are cooler. They don't absorb as much heat during the day, and therefore there's not as much heat to release at night. I desperately want to find $70,000 or $80,000. I may have to rob a bank or plunder my retirement fund in order to get this next step of technology. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. I think my wife would kill me, but this is the future. The SATE kids that you were talking about, they will be playing with a lot of this kind of technology as part of their classes. These are a very interesting bunch of motivated kids. You'll have a great time with them. All right, so from now on, I want to talk about some of the residential school stuff. So what I've been doing for the last number of years is working first with the TRC in trying to document where cemeteries associated with schools might be. And since 2021, working with a number of communities in their search efforts. And much of the work that I've been doing is dealing with this difficult challenge of integrating oral history information from survivors with whatever archival information that can be extracted either from the federal government, from the public records, from the NCTR, or any other source that they can find, utilizing all of this archival imagery with that memory and using it as a means of trying to narrow the search field down in order to identify target areas of high priority for the very, very expensive, very slow, and kind of ambiguous near-surface geophysics that is often described as the means by which these burials are found. We can't do this kind of geophysics survey over hundreds of acres. We need to narrow the search field down, or we'll be doing this work into the 22nd century. It's that time consuming. And I think this might be, this is pretty much the last slide. And it's kind of an effort to consolidate all of this diverse information into some kind of a summary. And all of these bits and pieces of information are coming from multiple different sources that have to be consolidated and evaluated within a spatial context. Drones are an important part of that, but the value added comes from the image processing, most frequently within GIS software. And I think that is pretty much it. I think that from my 10 years of fooling around with this technology, some of these basic issues and applications are pretty obvious to me, and I suspect that we could double the list if we thought about it a bit more. And with that, I'll thank you, and if there are any questions or comments.